Hello everyone, today we're going to be looking at this low-end gaming PC that costs me somewhere between £100 and £150 all in. This includes power supply, case and any peripherals that are needed. At the centre we have a Q8300 CPU. This is a Core 2 Quad CPU from the Yorkville generation of chips with a 45nm process, released in November 2008 at a price of about $200. It is for the LGA 775 socket, has 4 cores with no hyperthreading, runs at 2.5 GHz with 4 MB of cache, and has a TDP of 95 watts. The motherboard we're going to be using is this Micro ATX board from Asus. It is the P5 G41 TM LX2 GB. Comes with a PCI Express slot and 2 PCI slots. We have no chipset cooler on the bottom. We have 4 SATA 2, IDE if required, 2 RAM slots that take DDR3 up to 8 GB. You can pretty much take any CPU from the LJ5 775 socket. On the back we have 2 PS2 ports, a COM port, VGA, 4 USB 2, Ethernet and standard audio. We will be using 8 GB of RAM from Corsair that runs at 1600 MHz. DDR3 is pretty cheap now, so you can probably afford to go for some slightly faster RAM. These have got some big heat sinks on, but that's not really necessary, it was just cheap. For storage, we'll be using this BX500 128GB SSD, and for game storage we'll be using a 1TB green from Western Digital. That's not included in the price, but it just saves time for me. The most expensive part of the build is this RX480 from Gigabyte. It's a 4GB card that takes 8-pin additional power, has fan stop so the fans don't spin at idle. It's a pretty reasonable card. You can pick it up very cheap second hand. I think I spent about £50 on this particular card. It's in good condition and works pretty well in most games. Now while I quickly put this together, this machine, while cheap, it did cost me a little bit more because I bought all the parts individually. You could probably get this as a bundle or an old office machine for much less. I've seen them go for about £30 with board, CPU, RAM, power supply, case. So all you have to do really is grab a graphics card. The parts themselves are fine, but as you will see when we do some benchmarks, the CPU is not really strong enough for the more demanding titles. The motherboard's BIOS, while the latest, is still very basic, so we're unable to overclock the RAM to 1600 MHz, but that should be fine. The CPU is given with a limitation here, and as we can see in CPU Z, it scores 221 in single threaded and 880 in multi-threaded, so not exactly the fastest CPU in the world. We can also see the slow performance in Cinebench R20 when it comes to CPU tasks, where it only manages to score a low score of 573 overall, which puts it on par with a low-end i5 mobile processor, which overall means that for office applications and basic image editing and spreadsheets and that kind of thing, it performs reasonably well. So you could use this as a standard office machine, but that's not that exciting. You can pick up many cheap machines that can do that. Office applications don't require a lot these days, and with running PC Mark 10, it scores 2513, which isn't great, but it's enough for most people's needs. But enough about that. The main reason why I built this machine out of parts that I had was to see if it could run at least any kind of modern game, because that's what its purpose was. So let's look at some benchmarks and various older and more modern games to see what the performance is like. In Skydiver, it gets 13,562 points. In Firestrike, we get 7,534. In Time Spy, we get 3,230. In Night Raid, we get 10,205. And in the API overhead test, we find that DirectX 12 performs the best, with Vulkan not far behind, with DirectX 11 not performing that great. In terms of games I tested, they vary from reasonably new to much older, and the performance varies throughout. I've tried to order them in most playable to least playable. First up we have Tomb Raider, the rebooted version, running at 1080p. The performance in the benchmark was reasonable, but in the actual game itself it would jump between above 60 FPS to below 60 FPS depending on what was going on. It's all depending on what was happening in the scene and how stressed the CPU was. Because even in here, you can see that it's jumping around and the CPU is pretty much at 100% all the time. Next up we have Portal 2. It runs well above 100 FPS. No problem, but this probably is helped by the fact the scenes are much smaller and it's more of a puzzle game, and some of the larger puzzles it may drop a bit, but this is just from the start of the game. Next up is Alien Isolation, 1080p and high. This has a similar issue to Tomb Raider. The CPU is always near 100%. It is using all the cores, but it does sit around 60 and dips just below depending on what's going on. When there's more action, it can drop quite low, but due to the pace of the game, the FPS generally stays above 60.
Access to. She was trying to hack the elevator's security. Circuits are fried, easy fix. Just need to find a new data set.
Next up is Barshock Infinity, running on Ultra 1080p. Same as the previous games, the CPU is the bottleneck, but the frame rate stays pretty much above 60 constant, so you should be able to enable VSync and get a very smooth experience even on this old CPU.
I've got ammo!
You ain't going anywhere! Stand down!
More modern titles like Mutant Year Zero, the FPS can sometimes drop down to the teens and hovers around about the 40-50 mark depending on what's going on. The CPU is once again maxed out, so that is once again the bottleneck. Next is Doom 2016. This generally runs quite well on slower processors due to the Vulkan API, but as we can see here, it is hovering around the 50 to 60 FPS mark, with once again the CPU being the major bottleneck here. It all depends on what's happening in the scene.
Demonic presence at unsafe levels. Lockdown in effect.
Next up is Divinity Original Sin 2, 1080p high. This has a similar issue. You can sit at 60 FPS pretty much locked the entire time, apart from when in combat or when changing scenes you get the occasional dip. It all depends on what's happening. Once again, it's hitting pretty much a max CPU, but it will dip to about high 30s depending on what effects are happening. Here we have Warhammer Vermintide 2 running on low at 1080p. It struggles around 30 FPS when there's a lot going on, and this game can have a lot of hoarding enemies and that kind of thing, so it can struggle. In quieter areas like the opening of the game or in tunnels and various things, you can get to around 50 to 60 FPS, but this is no means smooth. Playable just about, but for a game like this you would certainly want a much higher frame rate.
I've been waiting for this.
I'm almost impressed, Kruber. Armed and free already. I was just about to help you with that stage.
What? Alicia?
In Dead by Daylight, this is running on high and 1080p. There is a setting higher than this, but this is on high. The performance is pretty awful. The GPU is almost idling most of the time. Afterburner is getting a bit confused regarding how much is being used, but the CPU is pretty much 100% locked. And in a game like this where you have to run away a lot, you want as smooth experience as possible. It occasionally gets into the 40s, but it really does struggle. Quite a challenging game, Monster Hunter World. Fun game if you don't mind a bit of grinding. The performance on this machine is awful. The frame rate is mainly in the teens, low 20s, occasional dip into single digits. It is not playable by any means whatsoever. This is a similar issue in Overwatch. This is on 1080p and high. The frame rate is all over the place because of the CPU. You may be able to add a frame cap of 30 FPS, but it still dips into the low teens depending on what's going on. It's pretty unplayable. Another game that's not really playable, even though it's much slower pace, is 2 Point Hospital. This game even struggles on much faster processors, especially on the larger maps, but here it's just, it can't handle much at all. You're talking high teens, mid 20s, regardless of the size of the map.
We're sorry for the litter that you dropped on our floor.
Games from Ubisoft also struggle on slow processors like this. This is Far Cry 3 running on the lowest setting. The frame rate is not great. It hangs around 30 FPS, even though this is a rather old game, and games of similar age run fine on this machine. So if you want to play Ubisoft games, you're going to need a much better processor or buy it on a console. A game that came out around about the same time as the CPU is Crysis. This game is generally very hard to run anyway, even on modern CPUs. You're getting around, we get above 30 FPS with this CPU on high. You could run it at a lower resolution and probably get a slightly better frame rate, but it really is limited by the CPU here. So you're not going to get great performance. If you want to play Crysis, probably better off buying the remastered version or using a better CPU.
This is Aztec. You copy? I read you. Give a sit rep. Something took a swipe at me on the way down. Oh, I'm caught up in the trees. Okay, Aztec. Hang tight. Help's on the way.
No man, up here. Come on.
Overall, the performance of this machine isn't great. The CPU is clearly the bottleneck in most games and whatever you're trying to do. You could certainly spend a little bit more and get a better motherboard and CPU. This motherboard and CPU cost me around about £10 as a bundle. You could certainly spend around £30 to £50 on a Sandy Bridge, Ivory Bridge or Haswell machine and get much better performance. You even might be able to get a early Ryzen system that will perform much better, but you're talking about £100 plus for those kind of bundles. Where this machine would shine would be with much older titles, maybe even an XP retro machine, but you would probably have to use a GTX 750 or 750 Ti, which I might look into. But for this machine, we will leave this here for today. If you like what you saw, please like, subscribe or comment below. I'm currently going through a lot of my older computer hardware from years and years and years ago, putting it together for various friends and family for cheap gaming machines. Current world events has rekindled people's interest in home PCs and gaming machines, so it seems a good time to revisit some of this hardware and see what it's capable of doing with current games and operating systems. We might end up finding a bargain in the meantime. If you wish to see anything in particular, leave a comment below. I'll try to post a video once a week, but it all depends on my current schedule and what time I have to record and capture content. So until next time, goodbye.